"You should be grateful we even let you stay here," my daughter-in-law said, her voice light, almost playful, as if she were offering me kindness instead of a warning. And in that exact moment, as she stood there in my kitchen with her perfectly pressed blouse and that thin smile stretched across her face, she had no idea she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. She thought I was the quiet widow who didn't understand paperwork, who nodded politely, who folded herself smaller each time she was dismissed. She thought I was someone who could be managed, moved, erased. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't see behind my silence, was that I had been watching, listening, remembering every detail, and I had already decided I would not be the one leaving with nothing. 72 hours earlier, the house had been unbearably still, the kind of stillness that settles after a life has been lived in every corner and suddenly stops. The morning light came through the kitchen window the same way it had for 35 years, falling across the oak table my husband built with his own hands. But the chair across from me remained empty, and I sat there with my coffee growing cold, staring at the faint ring it left behind, thinking about how quickly a lifetime can be, reduced to quiet routines no one else notices. Daniel had called the night before, his voice rushed, distracted, telling me he and Ashley would be coming by more often now, that they wanted to help. A word that sounded generous but felt heavy in a way I couldn't quite explain. And when they arrived later that afternoon, Ashley walked in like she already owned the place, her eyes scanning the room not with warmth, but with calculation, as if she were measuring where everything would go once I was no longer part of the picture. I remember how she stood by the doorway, tapping her manicured nails lightly against her phone, glancing at Daniel as if waiting for him to say something rehearsed, something we had all silently agreed on without including me. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't cruel, not outright, just careful, distant, like he was reading from a script he hadn't written, talking about how the house might be too much for me now, how maybe I should consider something smaller, something easier to manage. And I smiled then. The same small, polite smile I had worn for months, maybe longer, because it was easier than asking questions I already knew the answers to. That night, after they left, I walked through each room slowly, my hand brushing against familiar surfaces, the bookshelf, the hallway wall where we had marked Daniel's height year after year, the bedroom where my husband's jacket still hung behind the door, and I realized something I should have understood sooner. They weren't asking me to leave. They were waiting for me to agree to disappear. And the next morning, when the phone rang and Mr. Harrison's name appeared on the screen, the last person who had ever truly known how my husband thought, how he planned, how he protected, I felt something shift inside me, something steady and clear. And by the time Ashley stood in my kitchen days later, telling me I should be grateful, I already knew exactly who I was. And more importantly, I knew exactly who she believed I wasn't. Mr. Harrison did not waste time with pleasantries when I answered his call that morning, his voice steady, professional, the same voice that had sat across from my husband at our dining table years ago, going over documents I had never been invited to fully understand. And yet now he spoke to me directly, as if something had changed, as if I was no longer someone to be gently excluded, but someone who needed to know exactly where she stood. He asked if I had received any recent requests to sign paperwork, his tone careful, and I could hear the weight behind the question. So I told him the truth, that Daniel and Ashley had mentioned simplifying things, that they had used words like convenience and safety, but had not yet placed anything in front of me. And there was a pause on the line, long enough for me to realize that what he said next would matter more than anything they had told me so far. He explained that my husband had made certain decisions in the final months of his life, decisions that were not discussed openly because he believed that trust should come from love, not from fear of consequence. And for a moment I closed my eyes, picturing my husband sitting in his favorite chair, reading the newspaper, completely certain that he had arranged everything in a way that would protect me even when he was no longer here to do it himself. After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same spot where Ashley would later stand and measure the room with her eyes, and I folded my hands together, not out of worry, but out of clarity, because for the first time in months, the quiet in the house did not feel empty. It felt purposeful, as if every silence was giving me space to think without interruption, and I began to notice things I had ignored before, small details that now seemed impossible to overlook, like the way Ashley never asked how I was doing, only what I planned to do next, or how Daniel avoided staying in the same room with me for too long, as if my presence made him uncomfortable in a way he could not explain. Later that afternoon, when they returned, Ashley brought a folder with her, holding it casually, almost carelessly, but I saw the way her fingers tightened slightly around the edges when she thought I was not looking, and she set it down on the table without opening it, choosing instead to circle the conversation, talking about rising property taxes, about maintenance costs, about how difficult it must be for someone my age to keep up with a house this size. And I listened, nodding at the right moments, letting her build her case piece by piece, because I understood something she did not. People reveal more when they believe they are in control. Daniel finally spoke, his voice softer than hers, but no less distant, suggesting that maybe it would be easier if I considered moving somewhere smaller, somewhere closer to them. And I looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for the boy who used to run through these hallways, who used to ask me to check under his bed for monsters, and I realized that he was not looking at me the same way anymore. He was looking past me, toward a future that did not include me in the way I had always assumed it would. Ashley stepped closer to the table, tapping lightly on the folder now, as if she was ready to move the conversation forward. But I reached for my coffee instead, taking a slow sip, letting the moment stretch just long enough to unsettle her rhythm. And when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost gentle, as I told them I would need time to think, that I did not make decisions quickly, especially ones that involved leaving behind a life I had built over decades. And for a brief second, I saw something flicker across Ashley's face, not anger, not yet, but impatience, the first crack in the confidence she had been wearing so carefully. And I knew then that she had expected compliance, not consideration. She had expected me to agree without question, to step aside without resistance. And as they left that evening, with the folder still unopened on the table, I remained seated, watching the front door close behind them, fully aware that the game they thought they were playing had already changed. They just had not realized it yet. The next morning, I did not rush to touch the folder Ashley had left behind. I let it sit exactly where she placed it, right in the center of the table, as if it belonged there, as if it had always been part of my home. Because there is a certain power in not reacting immediately, in allowing something meant to pressure you to instead reveal itself fully. And as the sunlight shifted slowly across the surface of the table, inch by inch, I finally reached for it, opening it with steady hands, not because I was curious, but because I already knew what I would find inside. The documents were neatly arranged, each page carefully prepared, full of language that sounded helpful on the surface but carried a quiet finality underneath. Phrases about transferring responsibilities, about simplifying ownership, about ensuring long-term stability, all written in a tone that assumed agreement rather than invited it. And I read every word slowly, not missing a single detail, because I had learned long ago that the truth often hides in what people expect you to overlook. There was a section that outlined how the house would be placed under Daniel's name entirely, with a clause that allowed me to remain there temporarily. A word that seemed harmless until you understood that temporary meant conditional, and conditional meant that at any point, with the right justification, I could be asked to leave without question, and I could almost hear Ashley's voice as I read it, explaining how this was for my benefit, how it would make things easier for everyone, how I would not have to worry about anything anymore. And I sat there for a long moment, the paper resting lightly in my hands, thinking about how carefully she had constructed this illusion of care, how she had layered it with just enough kindness to make refusal seem unreasonable. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table, exactly where it had been, aligning the edges so perfectly that it looked untouched. And then I stood up and walked through the house again, slower this time, more deliberate, noticing not just the memories, but the details that defined ownership, the original deed framed in my husband's study, the old safe tucked behind the bookshelf, the quiet order in which everything had been maintained over the years. And I realized that Ashley had made a critical mistake. She believed that time and pressure would make me careless, that I would sign something simply to avoid conflict. But she did not understand that I had lived an entire lifetime managing far more complex situations without ever raising my voice. Later that afternoon, Daniel called, his tone tentative, asking if I had a chance to review the paperwork. and I could hear the expectation in his voice, the assumption that I would reassure him, that I would say everything looked fine, that I trusted him, and I answered calmly, telling him that I had looked at it and that I appreciated the effort, but I would need a few days before making any decisions. And there was a pause, longer than usual, as if he was not sure how to respond to something so simple. And when he finally spoke, he said that Ashley was just trying to help, that she wanted what was best for everyone. And I agreed, my voice soft, almost thoughtful, because agreeing did not mean surrendering. It only meant allowing them to continue believing what they needed to believe. That evening, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, I took out my phone and called Mr. Harrison again, not with hesitation, but with intention, and as it rang, I looked around the room, at the walls that had held my life together for decades, and I understood something with complete certainty. They were preparing to take something from me, but what they did not realize was that everything they thought they were taking had never truly been within their reach to begin with. And when Mr. Harrison answered, I did not ask questions this time. I simply told him that I was ready to move forward, because the moment for waiting had passed, and the moment for action had already begun. Mr. Harrison arrived 2 days later just after 9 in the morning, right on time, the way he always had been, carrying the same worn leather briefcase I remembered from years ago. And when I opened the door, he did not look surprised to see me standing there composed, ready, as if he had expected this version of me all along. He stepped inside quietly, taking in the room with a brief glance that seemed to register everything without lingering on anything, and we sat at the dining table where so many conversations had taken place before. Only this time, the air felt different, clearer, as if there were no longer anything unspoken between us. He placed a folder on the table, thicker than the one Ashley had left, and opened it with careful precision, sliding a set of documents toward me, not with urgency, but with confidence. And as I looked down at the pages, I recognized my husband's signature immediately, strong and deliberate, exactly the way he had always signed his name, and something in my chest settled into place. Not relief, not quite, but certainty. Mr. Harrison explained everything in measured detail, each sentence clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding, outlining how the house, along with several other assets, had been structured in a way that could not be altered without my direct consent, and even then, only under conditions that protected my long-term security, conditions that Ashley's documents had carefully avoided mentioning. I listened, without interrupting, absorbing every word, because understanding was more important than reacting, and when he finished, he leaned back slightly, watching me, not with concern, but with quiet approval, as if he had been waiting to see whether I would step into the role my husband had prepared for me. And I realized then that this was not something new being handed to me. This was something that had always been mine. I had simply never needed to use it before. Later that afternoon, Ashley returned, her movements sharper than usual, her smile thinner, as if patience had started to wear away at the edges of her confidence. And she asked, almost too casually, whether I had given more thought to the paperwork, her eyes flicking briefly toward the table as if expecting to see the folder open, signed, completed, but it sat there untouched, exactly where she had left it. And I could see the moment her expectation shifted into something else, something closer to irritation. Daniel followed behind her, quieter than ever, his presence more like a shadow than a voice. And for a moment, the three of us stood in the same room, the silence stretching just long enough to make Ashley feel it, to push forward with the conversation she had already decided the outcome of, explaining again how this was the best option, how it would remove stress, how it would ensure stability for everyone involved. And I nodded gently, allowing her to speak, because every word she added revealed more about what she believed she controlled. When she finally stopped, waiting for my response, I reached for the folder she had brought, lifting it slowly, almost thoughtfully, and I told her that I appreciated the effort she had put into preparing everything, that it was clear she had considered many factors, and for a brief second, she seemed reassured, her posture relaxing slightly, her confidence returning just enough for her to think the conversation was moving in her favor. And that was when I set the folder back down, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table, and told her, in the same calm tone I had used all along, that I would not be signing anything. The words were simple, direct, without hesitation, and they hung in the air between us, heavier than any argument could have been, and I watched as the expression on her face shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, controlled movements, the kind that reveal more than any outburst ever could. And Daniel looked at me then, truly looked at me, for the first time in a long while, as if he was seeing something he did not quite recognize, something he had not expected to find, and I held his gaze for a moment before turning away, because I did not need him to understand yet. I only needed him to remember this moment later, when everything became clear. The silence that followed my refusal did not break immediately. It lingered, stretching across the room in a way that made every small movement feel deliberate. And Ashley was the first to respond, though not with words at first, just a slight tightening of her jaw, a subtle shift in posture. The kind of reaction someone has when something does not go according to plan, but they are not ready to admit it yet. She let out a soft laugh, controlled, almost dismissive, as if what I had said was not a decision but a misunderstanding that could easily be corrected, and she stepped closer to the table, placing her hand lightly on the edge, leaning in just enough to suggest patience rather than pressure, and she began again, her tone smoother now, more careful, explaining that perhaps I had not fully understood the benefits, that this was not about taking anything away from me, but about ensuring everything was handled properly moving forward. And I listened without interrupting, not because I needed clarification, but because I wanted to see how far she would go when she believed she still had influence over the situation. Daniel remained quiet, his gaze moving between us, uncertain, as if he was waiting for one of us to define the outcome. And I could see the hesitation in him, the part of him that recognized something had shifted but did not yet know what it meant. And when Ashley paused, expecting me to respond differently this time, I simply repeated myself, calmly, clearly, that I would not be signing anything, not today, not tomorrow, not under these terms, and the repetition changed the room in a way that words alone could not, because certainty leaves very little space for negotiation. Ashley straightened then, her expression losing some of its softness, and for the first time, there was no attempt to disguise the frustration beneath her composure, and she asked, more directly now, what exactly I was planning to do, her voice carrying a sharper edge, and I answered with the same steady tone, telling her that I planned to continue living in my home, managing my affairs, and making my own decisions, just as I always had. And there was something about the simplicity of that statement that unsettled her more than any argument would have, because it removed the complexity she had relied on to justify her position. The conversation ended shortly after that, not with resolution, but with distance, and as they left, I noticed that Ashley did not look back this time, her focus fixed ahead, as if she was already recalculating, already adjusting her approach, and Daniel hesitated at the door for a brief second, his hand resting on the frame, as if he wanted to say something, but whatever it was, he did not say it, and he followed her out without another word. When the door closed, the house returned to its familiar quiet, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet I had known before. It was sharper, more defined, as if every sound carried intention, and I walked back to the table, placing my hand lightly on the folder Ashley had brought, feeling the weight of it without opening it again, because I did not need to read it twice to understand what it represented. That evening, I made a few small changes, nothing noticeable to anyone else, but meaningful to me. I organized documents that had been left untouched for years. I placed certain papers in envelopes. I made a list of names and numbers, each step deliberate, each action quiet. And as the hours passed, I felt something settle into place, not urgency, not fear, but readiness. Because what Ashley still believed was a negotiation had already become something else entirely, something she had not prepared for. And as I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the darkened room, I understood with complete clarity that the next time she walked into this house, she would not be stepping into a conversation. She would be stepping into the truth, and the difference between the two would be something she could not control. The following morning arrived with a quiet that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next, and I moved through my routine without hurry, preparing breakfast, opening the curtains, letting the light settle naturally across the rooms, because there was no longer any need to rush anything, not when every step I took now had purpose behind it. By mid-morning, my phone rang again, and I saw Daniel's name on the screen, which told me immediately that whatever Ashley had said to him the night before had not settled well, and when I answered, his voice carried a tension that had not been there before, a careful tone that tried to sound reasonable but could not fully hide the strain underneath. And he asked if we could talk, not later, not casually, but today, as if something had shifted from suggestion to urgency on their side. I agreed, of course, because agreeing to talk does not mean agreeing to anything else. And when they arrived less than an hour later, Ashley did not wait to ease into the conversation this time. She stepped inside with a sense of intention that was sharper, more focused, her movements controlled, but no longer soft, and she went straight to the table where the folder still sat, untouched, exactly where she had left it, and for a brief second, her eyes lingered on it, as if trying to understand how something so simple had not already been resolved. Daniel stood slightly behind her, his posture uncertain, and I could see that he had been pulled into something he did not fully understand, something he had agreed to without seeing the entire picture, and Ashley began speaking almost immediately, her tone firmer now, explaining that delays would only complicate things, that waiting could create unnecessary issues, that it would be better for everyone if the paperwork was completed as soon as possible, and I listened, allowing her to present urgency as if it were logic, because the more she pushed, the clearer her intentions became. When she finished, I did not respond right away. I simply reached for a small envelope I had placed on the table earlier that morning, sliding it gently toward her, not with force, not with emphasis, just a simple movement that shifted the focus of the room. And for the first time since she walked in, Ashley hesitated, her hand hovering just above the envelope before she picked it up, her confidence momentarily interrupted by something she had not expected to see. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the document inside, and I watched the change happen slowly, not dramatically, but undeniably, the slight narrowing of her gaze, the pause in her breathing, the way her posture adjusted as she read words that did not fit the narrative she had been building. And Daniel stepped closer then, looking over her shoulder, his expression shifting from confusion to something else, something closer to realization, though he did not yet fully understand what he was seeing. I remained seated, calm, my hands resting lightly in my lap, because there was no need to explain anything yet. The document spoke clearly enough on its own, and when Ashley finally looked up at me, her expression was no longer controlled in the same way. There was still composure, but underneath it, something had changed, something had begun to unravel, and I met her gaze without raising my voice, without altering my tone, and told her simply that before we discussed any further steps, I believed it was important that everyone understood exactly what had already been decided long before this conversation ever began, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, heavy with the realization that the direction of everything they had planned was no longer theirs to control. For a brief moment, no one spoke, not Ashley, not Daniel, and not even me, because the document in her hands had already said everything that needed to be said, and I could see it in the way her fingers tightened slightly around the paper, the way her eyes moved more carefully now, as if reading it again might somehow change what was written there. Daniel reached for the edge of the page, asking quietly what it meant, his voice no longer confident, no longer guided, but uncertain, searching for something familiar in a situation that had shifted beyond his understanding, and Ashley did not answer him immediately, which told me more than any words could have, because she had always been quick to explain, quick to control the narrative, and now, for the first time, she had nothing ready to offer. I let the silence remain, not out of hesitation, but because silence has a way of forcing people to confront what they would rather avoid, and after a few seconds, Daniel spoke again, this time more directly, asking me what exactly they were looking at, and I met his gaze with the same calm steadiness I had carried through every moment of this conversation, telling him that what he was holding was a copy of a legal structure his father had put in place years ago, something designed not just to preserve what we had built, but to ensure that no one could alter it without my explicit approval, not even him. Ashley finally looked up then, her composure still present, but thinner now, more fragile, and she asked, carefully, why she had never heard about any of this before, and I answered simply that it had never been necessary for her to know. because it was never meant to involve her decisions, and the words landed differently than anything else I had said so far. Not louder, not harsher, but more final, as if drawing a boundary that had always existed but had only just become visible. Daniel shifted his weight, running a hand through his hair, trying to process what this meant, and I could see the realization beginning to form, not all at once, but in pieces, the understanding that the plan he thought he was part of had been built on assumptions that were never true to begin with. And he asked, almost quietly, whether this meant the house could not be transferred the way Ashley had proposed, and I told him the truth, that it could not without conditions that had not been met and would not be met under the circumstances they had presented. Ashley placed the document back on the table. Then, more carefully than before, as if acknowledging its weight in a way she had not expected to, and she straightened her posture, regaining some of her composure. But it was different now, no longer rooted in certainty, but in adjustment, and she said that there must be some way to work through this, that there were always options, always solutions, and I nodded gently, because she was right in a way she did not fully understand. There were options, but not the ones she had been counting on. I stood up then, not abruptly, not to end the conversation, but simply to change the perspective of the room, and I walked to the window, looking out at the yard that had been part of my life for decades, the same yard where Daniel had played as a child, where we had hosted gatherings, where time had moved forward without question, and I told them, without turning around, that everything they needed to understand was already in front of them, that nothing had been hidden, only assumed, and that assumptions, no matter how carefully built, do not change reality. When I turned back to face them, I saw it clearly then, the shift that had finally taken place, not just in Ashley, but in Daniel as well, the moment where expectation gave way to awareness, and in that moment, the balance between us was no longer what it had been when they first walked through the door, because what they thought they were taking control of had never truly been theirs to control, and whether they accepted it or not, that truth was no longer something they could ignore. The room did not return to normal after that moment, because something fundamental had shifted, not just in what was understood, but in what could no longer be denied, and Ashley was the first to move, though not in the way she usually did. There was no immediate attempt to regain control of the conversation, no carefully chosen words to redirect the outcome. Instead, she stepped back slightly, creating space between herself and the table, between herself and the document, as if distance might somehow lessen its meaning, but it did not, and I could see it in the way her eyes flickered briefly toward Daniel, searching for something she had always relied on before, his agreement, his support, his unquestioning alignment. And this time, she did not find it in the same way. Daniel remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the paper, then on me, then back again, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all day, stripped of the confidence that had once made these conversations feel decided before they even began, and he asked a question that was not about the house, not about the paperwork, but about why he had never been told, why something so significant had been kept outside his understanding, and I answered him without hesitation, telling him that nothing had been hidden, that everything had been arranged in plain terms, but that understanding requires more than proximity. It requires attention, and attention is something that cannot be given on behalf of someone else. Ashley's expression tightened at that, not with anger, but with recognition, the kind that comes too late to change the direction of what is already unfolding, and she stepped forward again, this time with a different approach, her tone softer, almost conciliatory, suggesting that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, that maybe the situation could be revisited, adjusted, reworked in a way that would still benefit everyone involved, and I listened, because listening does not mean agreeing. And when she finished, I nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without accepting their premise, and I told her calmly that there was nothing to revisit, because nothing had been undone, nothing had been interrupted, everything had simply remained exactly as it had always been, and the only thing that had changed was their awareness of it. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not uncertain, but settled, as if the outcome had already taken shape and was simply waiting to be accepted, and Daniel took a slow breath, stepping back from the table, his posture no longer leaning toward Ashley, no longer positioned beside her in the same way, and I could see the distance forming, not just physically, but in the way he looked at her, in the way he was beginning to question something he had previously accepted without doubt. Ashley noticed it too. Of course she did. And for a brief moment, her composure faltered, just slightly, just enough to reveal the realization she could no longer avoid, that the structure she had relied on was not shifting in her favor, that the outcome she had expected was not simply delayed, it was no longer possible. And in that moment, she looked at me differently, not as someone to manage, not as someone to move aside, but as someone she had misjudged entirely, and I held her gaze, not with challenge, not with triumph, but with a quiet steadiness that required no explanation, because there are moments when words no longer add anything, when understanding arrives all at once, clear and undeniable. And as the weight of that understanding settled over the room, I knew that what had begun as an attempt to control had ended in something else entirely, something far more permanent. Because once someone realizes they never had the power they believed they did, there is no returning to the version of the story they told themselves before. No one argued after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been understood, and I could see it in the way Ashley stood there, no longer trying to reshape the conversation, no longer offering alternatives or softened explanations. She simply stood still, holding on to a version of control that had already slipped away, and Daniel, for the first time since they had walked into this house, did not look at her for direction. He looked at me. Instead, not with defiance, not with expectation, but with a quiet realization that something fundamental had changed between us, something that could not be undone with a conversation or corrected with another plan. I did not raise my voice. I did not move closer. I did not need to, because the space between us carried more weight than any gesture could have. And after a few seconds, Ashley placed her hands lightly against the edge of the table, steadying herself in a way she would never admit. And she said that she thought they were trying to help, that everything they had done was meant to make things easier. And I listened, because I had heard those words before, not just from her, but from many people over the years, people who believed that control and care were the same thing. And when she finished, I nodded once, slowly, acknowledging her perspective without accepting it. And I told her that help is something that is offered, not arranged without consent, and that what she had tried to do was not help. It was assumption. Daniel exhaled quietly, the tension in his shoulders shifting as if something he had been holding on to had finally been released. And he stepped back another inch, creating a distance that had not been there before. And I understood that whatever certainty he had carried into this room had been replaced with something else, something more honest, even if it was uncomfortable. And Ashley noticed it too. The way he no longer stood beside her in the same way, the way his silence no longer supported her position, and for a moment, she looked at him, searching for reassurance that did not come, and in that absence, the truth settled more deeply than any argument could have forced it. I walked to the door then, not to dismiss them, but because the conversation had already reached its natural end, and I opened it slowly, letting the light from outside fall across the hallway. And I told them that there was nothing more to discuss today, that everything that needed to be clear was already clear, and that moving forward would require understanding, not pressure. And Daniel nodded, not immediately, but after a brief pause, as if he was choosing that response rather than following someone else's lead. And he stepped toward the door, passing by me without speaking, his expression thoughtful, distant, but no longer disconnected in the same way it had been before. Ashley followed, slower, her movements measured, her composure still intact but altered, as if she was recalibrating something she had not expected to question. And as she reached the doorway, she stopped for a fraction of a second, just long enough to glance back at me. And in that glance, I saw it clearly, not anger, not resentment, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes that the person they thought they understood was never who they believed them to be. I did not say anything. I did not need to, because some moments do not require explanation. They simply exist, fully formed, undeniable. And as they stepped outside and the door closed behind them, the house returned to its quiet once more, but it was not the same quiet as before. It was steady, grounded, complete, and I stood there for a moment, listening to it, understanding that nothing had been taken from me, nothing had been lost. Everything had simply been revealed exactly as it had always been. And the difference now was that everyone else finally saw it too.